talk to you about my work on newsworthiness. And in particular, I want to introduce a corpus linguistic approach to study newsworthiness, and a linguistic approach to study newsworthiness as well. Before I start talking about this, I do want to acknowledge that the linguistic approach or discourse analytical approach to news values and newsworthiness was developed in collaboration with Helen 𝗂𝗂𝗪. So Helen 𝗂𝗂𝗪, she's based at the University of New South Wales, also here in Sydney. And she has expertise in analysis of images and multimodal discourse analysis. And this is something that I will not talk about today. So in my talk, I will focus on language and corpus linguistics. The other thing that is, I'll go into newsworthiness and news values in more detail in a second, but briefly, what is newsworthiness about? It's basically about what counts as news. So it's about the so-called news values, which tell us what is newsworthy, worthy of being in the news as a news story. And the basic assumption for us when we developed this discourse analytical or linguistic approach to news values was that we think it is important to systematically analyze how the newsworthiness of an event is actually established through language. And that in order to do that, you really do need an approach from linguistics. This then helps us better understand the role of language in the news. Because it's important to point out as well, if you've never heard the term newsworthiness or news values before, it is not a concept that originated in linguistics. It comes from different disciplines, so journalism and cultural studies. But it has been highly influential in journalism studies in particular, and it's becoming more and more influential in linguistics as well. So in today's talk, I want to introduce the approach to you, and I will also talk about some of the challenges or problems that we faced, or that I faced as well in developing the approach. Okay. So, and thank you, Tony, for mentioning the Sydney Corpus Lab as well, and the link is there, again, if you want to look at the lab and what it is. It is basically a platform for corpus linguistics with a focus on Australia. Okay, so what are news values? There's a lot of research on news values, and the literature is actually quite complex, but to give a very simplified definition, news values are the values that influence what makes a reported event newsworthy, worthy of being news. And in our research, we've suggested that you can approach news values from a number of different perspectives. So we call them the material, the cognitive, the social, and the discursive perspective. So when an event happens, we can look at that event, and here we are looking at news values from a material perspective, looking at the material reality of things. We can look at the event and we can ask, what is this event's potential news value for a particular community? So for example, depending on the people who are involved in the event, or the effect of the event on the local community or on people's lives. We can also look at the news workers, so the journalists and others who are involved in the news process. And we can ask analytical questions such as, what do news workers think about news values? How do they conceptualize news values and newsworthiness in their minds? Therefore, this is the cognitive perspective. But we can also look at what news workers actually do. So we can say, well, how do they apply news values in their social practice as they are producing the news? And so we call this the social perspective because of the focus on the social practice of news-making procedures. And the final perspective that we propose on news values is the discursive perspective. So there we can look at the texts that are involved in the news process, and we can ask the analytical question, well, how do these texts discursively construct news values? And so by texts, we mean, for example, the published news story, or maybe also a press release. We focus mostly in our work on published news stories, so the kinds of stories that you read online and that you hear on the radio, that you encounter in all kinds of mediums. And so the discursive perspective is really the perspective that we are taking on news values. And so we've developed an approach called Discursive News Values Analysis, or DNVA for short. we're taking this discursive perspective, of course, because we are discourse analysts and corpus linguists as well. And so we are really interested in looking at how news values are construed or established through semiotic resources. So that can be language, it can be images, and it can be other devices, semiotic resources, but I will focus on language, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, so what are these news values? We work with 10 news values for analysis of language. I will maybe go through them quickly, but in essence, we did not invent these values. This is quite important. So it's not our values that we came up with. These values, the ones that we've chosen and the terms that we've chosen, it's basically based on a review of the literature on news values. So there seems to be some basic consensus about these news values, that they are commonly recognized. But of course, we present our own take on them. So let me read a few of these definitions here. So the news values of consonants is about the event being discursively constructed as stereotypical. So we are looking here at stereotypes about news actors, social groups, organizations, countries, or nations. Eliteness is about the event being discursively constructed as of high status or fame. So this could be the people involved or countries, institutions. It could even be the event itself, like a high status event. Impact is about making sure, or if you're construing an event as newsworthy in terms of its impact, you're discursively constructing it as having significant effects or consequences. This could be consequences for the target audience, so the audience targeted by the particular news publication, or it could just be an event that is constructed as having significant effects more generally worldwide. Negativity is probably the most well-known news value. So our definition here is the event is discursively constructed as negative, for example, as a disaster, conflict, controversy, criminal act. Personalization is about including non-elite actors. So, for example, eyewitnesses, to ensure that the event is constructed as having a personal or human face. We have positivity. This is sort of the flip side of negativity. Proximity is an important news value. It's all about ensuring that the event is constructed as being somehow either geographically or culturally close to the target audience. Superlativeness, it's always about showing this event is high intensity or has a large scope or scale. And timeliness is about making sure that the event is discursively constructed as timely in relation to the publication date. So we're looking at the story published today. How are you constructing that event as timely in relation to today? This could be because it's constructed as new or recent or ongoing. And of course, then we also have unexpectedness. So I guess I want to make two big points about this list. News values are context sensitive. So for example, you do always have to look at the time of publication and also the target audience. So to give this example of proximity, if you're looking at, say, a reference to Brazil, and that reference occurs in a Brazilian news story for a Brazilian target audience, of course, that would construct proximity as a news value. But if that exact same reference occurred in an Australian news story for an Australian target audience, of course, it would not construct proximity, because Brazil is not either geographically or culturally close to Australia. So when you do a news values analysis, it is important to look at the publication, what type of publication it is, and also the target audience of the publication. The other thing is that the news values, as you could probably tell from my definitions, the news values are also fairly broad. So I'm going to give you an example on the next slide, but this is they're purposefully broad. So just to look at one example here, timeliness. So the news value of timeliness for us includes various different ways in which an event can be constructed as timely. So for example, the event can be constructed as new, as recent, as ongoing, as about to happen, as trendy or current, or as seasonal. These for us are all different elements of timeliness. So we are recognizing one news value here, timeliness, as opposed to recognizing a different news value for, say, recency, and another news value for currency. We want to limit the number of news values. At the same time, we also acknowledge that, you know, if you are a researcher and you are interested in timeliness, you might want to look at these aspects. And so you can do that, of course. It's just that we are not positing like a number of different news values here. We're positing timeliness as the overarching news value, and you could then look at how that timeliness is constructed, what dimensions of timeliness are concerned. Okay, so I hope this sort of brief introduction has helped you understand what news values are about. I'm going to give you more detail now about our linguistic perspective. So in essence, we've been involved in developing a linguistic framework for analyzing news values, and I just want to briefly talk about the problem that we faced. So as I mentioned earlier, news values is a concept that doesn't come from linguistics. It comes from a different discipline. And in that discipline, really news values have traditionally been seen as pre-textual, something to do with the selection criteria, but not necessarily involving text or language. And so therefore, they were also really considered as something that was almost atextual. So the problem that we faced then was that we were trying to bring a linguistic perspective to news values, or if you turn around, it was about integrating a non-linguistic concept into the linguistic analysis of news. So how do we develop a framework for linguistic analysis? So in essence, we took the news values as starting point. So the review that I showed you earlier showed that there was a basic consensus around news values. We then looked at some prior linguistic research on news values. There wasn't a lot at that point, but for example, Alan Bell's work, also in my PhD thesis quite a while ago, I was looking into this a little bit. And this sort of body of research in essence points to the importance of evaluative language, which is of course not surprising. If we're looking at values, they're constructed partially through evaluative language. We also looked more generally at other prior linguistic research that didn't mention news values at all, but might have talked about how can English construct something like nearness to the audience, which then of course relates to the news value of proximity. But here we would just be looking at linguistic research about nearness without necessarily any connection to news values, but we would use that to develop our framework. And the final strategy was to just do a lot of research, a lot of inductive research. So basically developing the framework from the ground up as well, bottom up way, through analyzing a lot of English language news stories from English speaking countries, and from different mediums as well. So we then, in essence, developed, or I developed a framework that links news values systematic to linguistic resources. And this then provides a framework for analysis of published news items. So in essence, you try to do this for each news value. So you're trying to identify linguistic resources that have the potential to construct news values. And these kinds of resources can actually be found at all levels of language. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and hopefully this will work. I will read the first example as well, but I'll just see if I can play it first.
In the headlines, in an unexpected development, no bodies have been found inside Christchurch's quake-ravaged cathedral.
So I'll read this first example from a radio story. In an unexpected development, no bodies have been found inside Christchurch's quake-ravaged cathedral. So hopefully you were able to hear the actual radio presenter, because he did a much better job than I did. And you could tell that there was a particular pronunciation on the no, which really reinforces the unexpectedness that is already constructed there through the adjective unexpected, and also grammatically through the negation. So here we've got resources for constructing the news value of unexpectedness. In the second example, this is from a print news story. British man becomes first person to visit all 201 countries without using a plane. So the without is presented here on the screen just as it was in the example. So the capitalization was capitalized in the actual published news story. And so here we can see that the capitalization as well also reinforces this unexpectedness that is already constructed through the word without. And looking at the third example here, world leaders were last night making preparations to converge in unprecedented numbers on South Africa for Nelson Mandela's funeral, likely to be one of the biggest global gatherings of powerful people in modern history. So here, of course, we have different, mostly lexes. So we have eliteness being constructed through, for example, world leaders, Nelson Mandela, powerful people. We have timeliness. Were last night making preparations to converge. You know, it's just happened last night. It's still going on. It's about to happen as well. And we have also construction of superlativeness and unexpectedness. So, you know, unprecedented numbers, one of the biggest in modern history. It shows you how big it is, but also in relation to prior events. So for each news value, you can identify particular language resources that tend to establish newsworthiness. I will not go through each news value because that would, I think, be a little bit boring and you can read up on this, but I'm just going to illustrate it with one news value. So here we have the news value of superlativeness. And as a reminder, our definition for this is that the event is discursively constructed as being of high intensity or large scope or scale. So in essence, the news value is just telling you the more X, the more newsworthy. So of course, if we're thinking about what kind of linguistic resources could be used in text to construct or establish superlativeness, we're looking for linguistic devices that intensify. And so we can look at quantifiers. So these are some examples in brackets that are authentic examples. So thousands of Romanis in Sweden, a tenfold increase. We can look at intensifiers, countries suffering badly from austerity. Intensified lexis, so we're looking here at words that have a meaning of intensity infused in their meaning. So cars were smashed together, so smashed is a high intensity verb. Some metaphors, personification and similes also express superlativeness. So for example, the reference is not just to a group of volunteers, but it's an army of volunteers. Or this example here, the thunderstorms are described, thunderstorms that look like the apocalypse. So it is really telling you how the scale and scope of these thunderstorms. Repetition is not that frequent, but I did find some examples in news. So for example, rather than saying a building was destroyed, building after building were destroyed. So many, many buildings. And comparatives or superlativeness are quite common. So one example here would be the worst of the worst, as a reference to how bad something was, a scale and the scope. Here's an example, again, a recent example that I just looked up. So this is an example about Hurricane Hannah. Hurricane Hannah pummeled the South Texas coast on Saturday night with howling winds and a surging sea that threatened a broad area already contending with an intense spike in coronavirus deaths. So in this particular paragraph, superlativeness is mostly constructed through verbs and adjectives, which I've bolded here. So you can clearly see intensified verbs like pummel and howl and surge. And you could also argue that both pummel and howl are also examples of metaphor or personification. There are also other news values in this example, of course. So for example, negativity in relation to the coronavirus deaths, and of course also timeliness through the time reference on Saturday night, so telling us that this was a recent event. So this is just an example of how you might go about this and what we have done. So I have got this framework for every single news value. Once you take that together, once you have established these kinds of resources that have the potential to establish news values, you can then use that to guide your analysis, but you're not using that as automatic checklist. You're always, of course, looking at the discourse and the context. And you can then use that to analyze published news stories, for example. And I will just present a few more snippets to illustrate it so that it becomes clearer. So this is in a recent example from COVID-19 coverage. This comes from an Australian news story, but it is about Brazil. I thought I would present it because it can be interesting to see how countries are presented in the foreign press. I might give you a bit of time to look at this. I'll just try to read it briefly. The new coronavirus hotspot, Australian residents fear for family in Bolsonaro's Brazil, I apologize. Australia might be overcoming COVID-19, but for those with family in Brazil, where cases have surpassed Spain and Italy, the fear is crippling. When 𝗕𝗫𝗔𝗘𝗟 𝗪𝗂𝗂𝗁𝗂 he tries not to let his mother know he's worried. When we talk by phone, we relax and we know each other safe. I tell jokes and I try not to say I'm on the other side of the planet, the 36-year-old tells SBS News from Melbourne. But his 62-year-old mother and his family live in the largest favela in Rio de Janeiro, and Brazilian President Bolsonaro is doing nothing to protect them, he says. I'm sure you can pronounce these words appropriately in your minds. So this is, of course, a news story where we have, it continues, but in this section, of course, we have some eliteness established through the references to Bolsonaro. We also have timeliness established, for example, through like new. But this part of the story is really mostly emphasizing the news values of personalization, negativity, and proximity. So how is it personalization? It's emphasizing personalization by really presenting this whole story through the eyes of one ordinary person, a son and his mother. So there's nothing elite about the person here or his mother. It is just one ordinary person, an ordinary Australian who talks about his relative. We have also negativity, of course, for example, through references to the negative emotions like fear and repeated, the fear is crippling. We also have worried. And then, of course, negative lexis, negative references to the coronavirus hotspot and things like is doing nothing to protect them. So negativity here as well. Proximity. So, you know, as I mentioned earlier, Brazil is far away. It's not necessarily culturally near Australia. But proximity is established here through the reference to the Australian residents in Brazil. And this is, of course, quite typical of news reporting. So when you report on an event in a distant country, especially if this is, for example, a negative event, reference will often be made to casualties from your own country, from the country of the target audience. So, you know, you're focusing on the on us versus them. This is quite a well-known feature of news reporting, which, of course, you can be fairly critical of. So the references, of course, don't really construct the event as geographically near the audience, but they establish, however, that someone from the audience's community is involved. And so, you know, this is newsworthy. This is relevant to the Australian audience because Australian residents are involved as well. Here's another example from recent COVID-19 coverage. This one is a headline of a story about Germany easing some of their restrictions. So the headline is "Order and Optimism as Shoppers Return to Berlin Streets." There's quite a bit of text, and then later in the story you have this quote by a German wine merchant. "If you ask me, the reason Germany's done well so far in keeping infections down is that German people love order. We call it Ordnung," said Holger Schwarz, the owner of 𝗕𝗏𝑐ulture, a wine merchant. So here you can see that the headline and also in this quotation later really frame this around the stereotype of Germans and their desire for rules and order. So I would argue then that in these sections, like in the headline and in this quote later on, this is really constructing the news value of consonants. Now, of course, it is the wine merchant who made this statement, but it's the newspaper who, first of all, chose to use this as an angle in the headline, order and optimism as shopper return, and also then to include quote instead of, for example, including quotes from other ordinary people. And Australia, for example, if you compare those situations, in the early stages had done quite well with COVID-19, but no one talked about Australian people loving order. So the reporting of COVID-19 in the early stages, I don't know if you noticed this yourselves as well, actually drew on well-known stereotypes about nationalities. You also saw this in other COVID-19 stories, for example, about Italy. So I'm not actually doing or planning to do an analysis of COVID-19 reporting myself, but I just collected a few examples for this talk. But I do think that actually a news values analysis of COVID-19 reporting with a focus on consonants could certainly be quite interesting. So I presented these examples as well to show you that, of course, you can apply this framework by doing discourse analysis, just like I've done now. And normally you would, of course, analyze the whole news story, not just the extracts or snippets like I have done. So the second problem that I faced as a corpus linguist was, what do you want to do if you want to analyze more data and you don't want to do you can't do manual analysis? So of course you could use computer-assisted annotation if you have a small scale corpus. But if you have a larger corpus, you could maybe try to experiment with corpus linguistic techniques. So the question then was, how can we analyze news values using corpus linguistics instead of manual discourse analysis? So I want to focus on this problem next. So I've undertaken over the years a number of studies where I've tried to experiment with different corpus linguistics techniques, quite classic techniques such as frequency lists, so looking at the frequency of word forms, lemmas, n-grams, part of speech tags or semantic tags. So for example, looking at high frequency items to figure out what news values might be constructed through these. Keyness analysis, so looking at words that are statistically unusually frequent in a particular corpus to maybe figure out what news values occur around a particular topic. Collocation analysis, so looking at a particular topic again and trying to figure out what news values are associated with the topic by looking at the words that co-occur with that. And concordance analysis has been crucial really in all of these by looking at individual instances in their context, and I'll show you some examples later why that is really important. So I'm not going to talk about all of these case studies, but in essence, an overview of what we did in these projects. So we used a corpus of British news discourse and corpus linguistic techniques to really identify what I call the rhetoric of newsworthiness. So in essence, you're looking here at what kind of words and structures are frequently used in British news discourse to construct news values. In another case study, I tried to identify the news values that occur in stories from news organizations that people widely share on Facebook. So the question here is, for example, do people only share news stories where positivity is foregrounded? So, you know, looking at that from the perspective of what kind of news stories, but from news organizations, are shared widely, what kind of news stories become viral. But we've also done quite a few case studies around particular happenings or topics, issues, or news actors. So there's a few on the slide that we looked at, a suicide bombing, Australian floods, US hurricane, looking at news values around cycling and cyclists, and more recently looking at news values around National Day reporting. So today, I want to very briefly talk about one example, and that's a little bit of a study is already published about reporting on Hurricane Katrina in the US. So even though this is not my most recent corpus linguistic study, I wanted to focus on it today in my talk because it really is the one that uses the largest corpus so far. We've used a range of smaller to larger corpora. So this one is comprised of US reporting from the months of August and September 2005, and the corpus was compiled by Amanda Potts at Lancaster University. So in this study, we used a variety of different corpus linguistic techniques to test how they could tell us, whether they could tell us something about news values and newsworthiness. We used a tagged lemma-less, collocation, part of speech tagging, and semantic tagging. And also our analysis was both providing a synchronic snapshot, but also trying to identify changes in the news values construction over time. So now I'm just going to give you a little brief insight into this study at just focusing on collocation and just focusing on the synchronic part of the analysis. If you want to find out more about the other aspects of the talk, you can have a look at that publication maybe later. This is in the interest of time. So what you see on the screen here, and I'm going to go point out some of the key examples, so don't worry if this is quite a lot now. But what you see on the screen is the top 100 right-hand collocates of the word hurricane. So we were looking at words that occur after hurricane on the right-hand side of the text, and that are strongly associated with the word hurricane. So if you look at, for example, the first row here, the proper nouns, you can see that there's a lot of names there, like Katrina, Rita, Andrew. These are the names, of course, of various hurricanes, including Hurricane Katrina, but also other hurricanes, Rita, Andrew. And you can also see in the proper nouns some examples of US locations like Gulf, Florida, Miami. So these, of course, these kind of geographical references would construct proximity for the US target audience. Remember, we're looking at US reporting here. If you look at the noun collocates as well, here, down here, you can see that most of the noun collocates seem to establish either or negativity, superlativeness, and or impact. So, for example, through references to providing help. So you have nouns such as collocates such as relief or efforts, protection, recovery, and so on. Also, a lot of the nouns point to the negative effects and the power of the hurricane. So you have collocates such as aftermath, devastation, damage, impact, disaster, havoc, rampage, fury. And you also have references in the noun collocates to the affected people. So you get words like victim, victims, evacuees, survivors. We could maybe argue that some of these references also construct personalization, because it's showing us that the event is involving ordinary people, not elites. However, if there are sort of generic group references like survivors, evacuees, it's not a very strong instance of personalization because it's not focusing on one individual. And also, there are only some nouns in the collocates that appear to be quite unrelated to news values. So we also find that things like nouns that point to the stages or actions associated with hurricanes, like, for example, landfall activities or hurricane activity, hurricane season, things like that. So importantly here, note, for example, the noun collocate fury, so the hurricane's fury, which is also an example of a metaphor and personification as well. If we look at the verbs, it's quite similar to the nouns. Most of the verb collocates construct negativity. For example, verbs like threatened, superlativeness, for example, these high intensity verbs like slammed, or impact, for example, caused. And often all three news values are really established simultaneously by verbs. So for example, if you look at verbs like devastated or ravaged, they really construct the hurricane as high in negative impact. And again, there are only some of the verbs that do not appear to have anything to do with news values, but rather refer to the stages or actions of the hurricanes, like approached, so the hurricane approached, or passed, again referring to the stages. And again, also you can see examples of metaphor or personification. So the hurricane roared, something we more associated with animals. If you look at the adjective, there's only one adjective there, subsequent. By itself, subsequent doesn't really establish any news value, but if you do look at it, it points to something, right? The hurricane subsequent, what? So if we look at this more closely through concordance analysis, you can see that it is sort of involved in this particular kind of construction. So it primarily seems to co-occur with word forms referring then to the negative impact of the hurricane. So subsequent evacuation, flood, flooding, floodwaters, levee breaks, closing of this university, damage, relief efforts. So the whole construction is clearly constructing negativity and impact. So we have a cause-effect relation set up by a reference to the event, plus subsequent, plus then some kind of noun referencing its impact. So that's quite an interesting rhetorical structure, if you will. If we briefly go back to this here in the other row, the bottom row, you can see that there's interestingly a few numbers here, and they seem to be references to years. So again, this is something that is interesting to look at more qualitatively. And in fact, they seem to indicate the importance of historical comparisons. So here's a few examples. Industry experts say Katrina caused far more damage than Hurricane Andrew, the 1992 storm that leveled parts of South Florida. the magnitude of the disaster in St. Bernard has surpassed Hurricane Betsy in 1965. Katrina would also be the nation's deadliest hurricane since 1900. Katrina is comparable in intensity to Hurricane Camille of 1969, only larger. So as I mentioned, we have the year collocates pointing to the importance of historical comparisons. They seem to be sometimes used for either superlativeness or unexpectedness, so telling us how bad Hurricane Katrina really was when you compare it to other hurricanes. And also, incidentally, this also explains why we found the references to the other hurricane names in the proper noun collocates. So that's so that's quite interesting as well. So this was just a very brief extract from this study for the purposes of time, but what you can see is that you can use corpus techniques with a fairly large corpus, and it can help you to uncover particular phraseologies, figurative devices, and rhetorical structures and rhetorical strategies that construct news values. So in the Katrina corpus, for example, you have this cause-effect relation relating to the news value of impact that is set up by some kind of reference to the event, followed by the subsequent, and then some kind of reference to the impact of that event. You have examples of metaphor and personification, which also seem to be related to superlativeness construction. So the hurricane roared, the hurricane's fury, the hurricane's wrath, really personifying the hurricane here. And the historical comparison functioning again through to establish the superlativeness of the hurricane. So I thought it'd be interesting, because this was Hurricane Katrina reporting, I thought it'd be interesting to go back to this example that I showed you earlier, which is quite a recent example here, which was about a different hurricane. So Hurricane Hannah pummeled the South Texas coast on Saturday night with howling winds, a surging sea, that threatened a broad area already contending with an intense spike in coronavirus deaths. It continues, Hannah is the first hurricane for the 2020 Atlantic storm season, which is expected to be unlike any other in recent memory. So it's quite interesting to see that this little extract here from another hurricane includes some of the same strategies. So again, we have metaphor and personification with pummel and howl, and a historical comparison, expected to be unlike any other in recent memory. So it is possible, of course, I haven't tested this in more detail, but it is possible that some of the results that we found in relation to Hurricane Katrina reporting apply more generally to hurricane reporting, and possibly also maybe to other environmental disasters and that are reported in the news. This is how they are made relevant to us. This is how they are made newsworthy. So going beyond this particular study, what lessons have I learned from all of the case studies so far? Well, first of all, I would say that all classic corpus linguistic techniques can be useful when applied carefully. So what I mean is you always need to consider the context, the surrounding text, and the target audience as well. But I also think that corpus linguistic techniques do have their limitations, and of course can't fully replicate manual discourse analysis, the close reading of full texts. And lesson number 3, I would say, is that qualitative analysis using concordances is crucial. So of course, if you have a small data set, you can analyze the use of all instances to see if and how they construct news values and what the quantitative tendencies are. In a larger data set like the Hurricane Katrina corpus, you need to downsample. So for example, analyzing maybe 50 or 100 random concordance lines and then extrapolating from the results. And you can see why this qualitative analysis is necessary in this example for the word first on the slide. So first is an interesting word. In a frequency list, it often comes up in news reporting, but it is not always used to construct news value. So this example comes from that story that study I mentioned earlier, which we have been doing most recently about National Day reporting. So here in the first line we have a reference to the coming of the first fleet. In the second line we have the injustices committed against the first Australians. In the third line, Waddy is the first ordinary Australian to be appointed Australian of the Year. In the last one, forcing the cancellation of the city's Australia Day fireworks for the first time in the 32-year history of an event. So you can see that in line 3 and 4 is very clearly the use of the term, the adjective first here, very clearly related to the construction of news values, such as, timeliness, newness, and also unexpectedness. So the first time this has ever happened and how rare it is as well. But in the first 2 lines, first refers to the first fleet, so the British ships invading Australia, and also to the first Australian, the people who lived on this continent before the invasion, i.e. the Aboriginal people of Australia. Lesson number 4 would be, don't just focus on the obvious. So if your starting point is, say, a frequency list, don't just focus on the obvious words in the frequency list. Give you some examples. Of course, yes, it is useful to look at the obvious pointers. So if you find out that if you're doing an n-grams analysis, so looking at word combinations, and if you find that the n-gram, the first, is quite frequent in your corpus, of course it's interesting to look at it because it most likely does point to the construction of news values. And you can see that in these examples. So, yes, it should be analyzed qualitatively because it is most likely going to tell you something about how timeliness and unexpectedness possibly are constructed in your corpus. But it's also interesting to sometimes consider seemingly neutral content words that you cannot imagine how they might relate to news values at first. And I'm going to give you this example again from the study on the National Day of Australia. So the National Day of Australia is Australia Day, and that is celebrated on the 26th of January. So National Day, I think the equivalent in Brazil is the 7th of September. So in this study, we did a study on National Day reporting, how National Day celebrations are reported. And we looked, for example, at collocates of Australia Day. And these collocates included a word such as date. And it seems really neutral. I mean, it seems like it might have nothing to do with news values. But if you look at the concordance lines here, you can see that the co-text really always points to a current controversy in Australia about changing the date. So 26 January is the date right now, and that actually marks the date in 1788 that the first fleet of the British ships landed on the shores of the country that we now know as Australia. So to many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, it actually marks the invasion of their lands and the beginnings of the oppression of First Nations people. So there's actually a push to change the date and a controversy and debate. And you can see that the references, the collocate date actually occurs in all of these references to the conflict. So for example, demanding the date to be changed, the push in the second line, the push to changing the date, has lashed, number 3, has lashed out at people who want to change the date, and so on. You can see that most of the instances of date occur in these references to conflict. So in its co-text, together with the surrounding text, it does construct negativity because it refers to the conflict and debate. Okay, even innocent grammatical words can be interesting to look at. So just very briefly, this comes from a study we did about floods, flooding, and in our data, the word away was identified as highly frequent. So it was the 20th most frequent word in our data set compared to British News Corpus, where it occurred as at rank number 227. Now, you can see that 2 instances just refer to locations. So in line 3 and 4, a kilometer away from where they were, about 9 kilometers away. So that is just referencing to location. It doesn't construct any news value. But if you look at the other examples, the majority of them are really part of verbal phrases that refer to the effects of the floods. So things like took away, sweeping, swept away, blown away, washed away. So again, it's actually concerned with establishing the news value of impact, because it is really establishing and pointing to the consequences of the floods. So if we had to put, for example, the word away into some kind of grammar bin or other bin, we would not have identified this at all. Okay, so final third problem I want to briefly discuss is so I've discussed I've discussed 2 problems. The first one was how to develop a linguistic framework. The second problem, how to analyze news values through corpus linguistics. The third problem is how do we take this beyond English language news? So just as a reminder, the linguistic framework that I developed was really developed on the basis of consulting research in English linguistics, but also analyzing English language news stories. could we just apply this framework to other languages and cultures? I would suggest that the answer is only extremely carefully. And of course, you know, this is not something new, but in cross-linguistic research, we must be really careful and we must avoid assigning primacy or universality to English. If you're interested in looking at news values construction in other languages and cultures, I would suggest that the first step might be to just, first of all, do some research around news values. Are these particular news values relevant to the given culture? So that might mean looking at research in journalism studies, for example, that have looked at news values from different perspectives. The second step, I would say, is to take the news values, not the linguistic resources, as a starting point. So for example, let's say proximity would be the news value, to then look at, well, how is proximity constructed in this particular language, rather than looking at the resources identified for English and just applying them to the other language. That might be a good way of starting to then independently develop an inventory of linguistic resources for a given language. If you are interested in this, we did a first study where we tried to do this with Chinese, and this should be out later in this year, but really they are just baby steps, and there's much more research necessary in this area on looking at other languages and cultures. So before I conclude, I just want to say, why should we do DNVA? Why is it interesting? One reason is that news values are widely considered as having an ideological dimension. So they have been widely recognized as not being natural or neutral, but rather culturally and socially constructed. They reflect societal priorities. News values establish an ideology about what is regarded as news, and the presence of news values can also reinforce other ideologies. So for example, consonance. So our suggestion is that DNVA can be used as an additional tool for critical linguistic analysis of news stories, whether you do that in media linguistics, social linguistics, or critical discourse analysis, not to replace the existing tools, rather to complement the toolbox. The other thing is that we are also using this in journalism education, and we also think that it can be used in applied linguistic research to find out how news is a semiotic practice. How is news packaged as news? Just a very quick example here. This comes from a report about a cruise ship that was stranded in Sydney. I just very quickly read it. Captain Adriano Binacchi, who manned the stranded Carnival, is officially the world's nonplussed sea captain. The ship took on 6 to 10 meter swells, but in taking question from his media's attitude seemed to be no big deal. When asked if facing such violent sea conditions is rare, he replied, "Not really, it's not my first time." Were there any injuries sustained on board? No injuries, just some minor seasickness. Damage? What damage? Maybe some glass window panes, minor things. So this is quite interesting because you can see the journalist is really trying to elicit quotes that they can use to establish the event as newsworthy in terms of unexpectedness. Is it rare? Impact or negativity, you know, injuries, damage. So, you know, what are the negative effects? But they can't use those quotes, so they can't do it. So what they do instead is they turn the captain and the interview in the news into the thing that is newsworthy. So suddenly the captain becomes officially the world's most nonplussed sea captain. So this is quite interesting and skillful skillful way of how the journalists used language to construct this event as newsworthy in this respect. So just focusing on other elements of that discussion. Okay, so just to conclude with a few points about DNVA. If you're doing corpus linguistics, many English language corpora contain news reporting, so an awareness of news values can be important for interpreting the frequency of certain linguistic features in your corpus that you might find. If you're interested particularly in analyzing news, DNVA treats journalism as a semiotic practice or textual system, and news values as discursively constructed rather than only pretextual. Discursive news values analysis will show you how an event is constructed as newsworthy, whether particular news values are associated with particular people or events, and which newsworthy aspects of an event have been emphasized. You can certainly combine it with other analytical approaches, and you can undertake it manually or computationally, or indeed triangulating different kinds of methods and approaches. If you're interested, I just put a link to Kaleidographic, which is just a little tool that Helen Capel and Lawrence Anthony, with a little bit of input from me, it's really all their output, have developed a little visualization tool that you can use to visualize results also for other types of discourse analysis. So I've just included the link if you want to check that out. So if you want to find out more, the references are all in the book. We have a website as well, and feel free to use this little video in your education if you are interested.